This is an A-level biology presentation looking at populations and ecosystems and specifically at different types of relationships between organisms. To get started, think about all the different biotic and abiotic factors that can affect an organism. You have 11 pictures in front of you. Each one represents a particular biotic or abiotic factor. Pause the presentation now, try and work out what all 11 are, and when you're ready, restart the presentation and you'll get the answers. So pause the presentation now. These are the answers for all the different images. You need to be able to identify and give examples of biotic and abiotic factors. And A-level exam questions, they could specifically ask you about any one of these or any combination of these, so you need to be aware of all of them. The extension question you're asked is identify how each factor could be measured. And again, each of those individually has its own piece of equipment. You should be able to identify the piece of equipment that would be used to measure each one of these. Pause the presentation now, try and work out what equipment you'd use. And then when you're ready, you can restart the presentation and go through the answers. Again, if there's anything you get wrong, make sure you take the time to memorize it before you get any exam questions. So pause the presentation now. And here are each of the answers. Again, if any of them you weren't aware of, make sure you do memorize it. So the main types of relationships you're going to be asked about in any exam question is going to be based around competition, or it's going to be based around the whole concept of predation. If you're talking about competition, you need to use the terms like adaptation, interspecific, and intraspecific. If you're talking about predation, you'll be using a predator-prey graph and explaining what happens during the predator-prey graph. Quite often what you'll also lead into is things like natural selection and evolution. So you need to make sure you're clear on what natural selection is, evolution is, and speciation is, because a lot of the time these terminologies can be blurred together. So make sure you're very clear on the differences between those three concepts. In terms of competition, you need to be aware obviously different factors that organisms can compete for. Just be very cautious. The first thing that everyone thinks of when we talk about competition is animals. Plants will compete just as much as animals will. And you've got intraspecific, which is where it's competition between the same species, organisms of the same species, and interspecific, where we have competition between organisms from different species. So again, be careful because the question may talk about intraspecific or interspecific. In terms of predator-prey graph, here is a basic predator-prey graph, and all you have to do is time yourself for 5 minutes and write an answer to the question. Describe the relationship seen in the graph. If you have time, there is an extension question asking about should you include values. So pause the presentation now, give yourself 5 minutes, come up with the best answer to the question, describe the relationship seen in the graph. So pause the presentation now. So one of the most common mistakes people will make in a question like this is they will explain rather than describe. The question's asking you to describe, which is simply using the values and data on the table to say about the lines going up and lines going down, what one goes up first, what goes up second, etc., etc. At no point do you have to say why these things are happening. Why questions are explaining questions. When you have an explain question, you can include some elements of describe, but if you're given a describe question, you don't tell them why things are changing, you just simply say, this is what you see in the graph or table. In terms of the actual answer, there's a 5-point answer, which should give you between 5 and 6 marks on any question. And you can see that, yes, we have included values from the table. Of course, we should include values from the table. The values are given in the graph. We would be very silly not to use them. And all I've simply done in this is gone through and identified what happens to the rabbit, and then talk about what happens to the predator, and then talk about what happens to the rabbit and what happens to the predator. Notice I have not described why it happens, but in my head I've clearly been thinking about, well, this would go up, this would go down, why would this happen, what effect would it have, etc., etc., etc. I just haven't taken the time to write down any of the explain or why answers because they're not worth any marks. What you have to do is you've got to plan your answer and think about before you start the question, what do I actually need to include to get the marks? If I'm talking about predator-prey graphs, I've got to talk about predators and I've got to talk about preys. If I'm talking about a describe question, I've got to talk about patterns. I don't have to say why the patterns occurred. I can also talk about when I have curved lines, I can talk, or even straight lines, I can talk about the gradient, how steep the line is. So it makes sense if I talk about gradients, I can't talk about an increase and decrease in the steepness of the line. Yes, I could, but gradient is a better word to use. You also should talk about the rate of change and how with a steep gradient you have a rapid rate of change, whereas with a much more gentle gradient you have a lower rate of change. And that's the big difference between GCSE and A-level. At GCSE you simply had to say line goes up, line goes down, whereas at A-level you've got to talk about the fact that it goes down, but it goes down at a very steep gradient or gentle gradient, meaning there is a very rapid rate of change or a very slow rate of change. So in the previous question, you were asked to describe the relationship. Now you're being asked to explain the relationship. Before I go any further, simply pause the presentation, give yourself 5 minutes and come up with the best answer you can to explain the relationship seen in the graph. And then when you're ready, you can restart the presentation. Pause the presentation now. So in terms of an answer to explain the relationship, we do sometimes have to include and explain questions. We have to include a little bit of description, but the least amount of description possible in order to make sense of our answer. Because you may get 1 mark for description, you certainly won't get more than that if the question says explain. The focus should be on why the changes have happened. So certainly in your head you should have a list of here's the things that have happened, but you don't necessarily have to write them down. The marks are for why they've happened. So you needed to talk about again the steepness and why lines have gone up or gone down. You also need to talk about the fact that there is a delay between a change in the prey or predator and a change in the prey or predator following that. They're not immediate. One doesn't immediately affect the other. There is a little bit of delay. You need to bring it in terms of competition, and obviously you need to talk about the fact that the prey or the food of the predator, and as a consequence supply and demand also comes in there as well. Remember, you can describe, but just be cautious. Don't get caught down or bogged down in the description. You'll notice that in the answer that I've given you, there is no reference to any values on the graph. It's not to say that you can't do that. It's just a case of don't put a huge amount of time and effort into it because it's not going to carry a lot of marks. So now I've got to go through the lesson and come up with a tweet with a maximum of 280 characters that explains what the lesson was all about.